You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm Claire Pedrick, and today it's my pleasure to have as our guest Timothy Clarke, who wrote the book The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. So we talked with Helen Pattison a few weeks ago from War Child about psychological safety and children in war zones. And I invited her after I'd invited Timothy, because I thought it'd be great to have a bit of a view from different angles. So you've done lots of work and research and written a great book, Timothy. Tell us how you got to writing it and a little bit about you.
Well, the origin story, Claire, I guess is a little bit interesting. So I trained as a researcher at Oxford. I did a PhD in social science, and I focused on culture and cross-national culture, and then applied that mainly to organizations. And that's been my focus ever since, is working with organizations. And I went back and just went through all of the research literature related to psychological safety because I felt that there was a key there that we had been missing. And I think you'll find this interesting, Claire. So the original citation of psychological safety goes back to 1955 and the American psychologist Carl Rogers. So he wrote a paper called Toward a Theory of Creativity, which you can find online. And in that paper, that he wrote in 1955, he introduces the concept of psychological safety, and he talks about what he thinks it is back then. And he was doing it in the context of a therapist-patient relationship. And before that, he introduced a term which many people remember from his work called unconditional positive regard.
Yeah.
Which most of us know that term. And in the coaching world, that's equally important as in the world of therapy. And so it's interesting that's where the concept of psychological safety has its beginnings. And then, of course, we've been applying that to interpersonal relationships of all kinds ever since. And I think that what's happened is in the last 3 years, the world has consolidated around the term psychological safety. And there's more and more empirical research that's coming out that shows a direct link between psychological safety and a number of outcomes, not just one, but it could be attrition, it could be productivity, it could be innovation, it could be employee health and wellness, it could be learning agility, it could be inclusion. There are a number of critical outcomes that are directly related to psychological safety. And so many of us are just saying, this is perhaps the biggest breakthrough in organizational science in a generation. That's how significant this is. Now, of course, we've had to work at being able to measure it accurately, right, using a psychometric scale. But I think we've gotten there. And so for me, this is unbelievably exciting and important in what we do. So there's a little bit of a background, Claire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm really curious to know, what do you know now that you didn't know when you finished writing your book?
Well, I think we've continued to add insights. I'll give you one related to innovation. And this has come after with additional research. As we look at the connection between psychological safety and innovation, that's a very strong connection. The correlation is very high. And so the chief kind of the central finding there, Claire, is that with innovation, the quality of interaction, right? So think about a team. Innovation is a team sport. And what we found is that the quality of interaction regulates the speed of discovery. That's a very important finding.
Yeah.
And so that's just one. The corollary principle to that, kind of stated in the negative, is to say that fear breaks the feedback loop.
Ah.
And so if you think about how important that is, right? So if there's pervasive fear on a team, that breaks the feedback loop. And so then look at the quality of interaction. Well, it's going to be very poor. It may even stop. And then that in turn regulates the speed of discovery. So your discovery is going nowhere.
Mm.
So those are a couple of insights that have become even clearer since the book, just as an example.
Yeah. That's so interesting, isn't it? Because looking at both sides does give a different kind of a different kind of view.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what do you mean by psychological safety?
The
I
way
know
that
I've read your
I
book, but our listeners may not have.
right. So I have an operationalized definition of psychological safety, and this is what it is. So it is a culture of rewarded vulnerability. Now, sometimes, Claire, people will say, well, psychological safety means that you can speak up, or psychological safety means that you can be yourself, or psychological safety means that you can share um, whatever you want without fear. You'll see people give bits and pieces, right? They'll provide a partial definition. Okay, but underlying all of those things, what are we talking about? The mechanism is that we are rewarding vulnerability. That's the underlying mechanism. And then of course I've laid out 4 stages in doing that, right? But the underlying concept is that we are rewarding each other's vulnerability, and there are different ways to do that. So that's my definition.
And I love that because that's an action and not a state.
True. Well, let's talk about that. The state is the outcome,
Mm.
right? And the state is delicate and dynamic. There's nothing permanent about it. It's perishable. So the state of psychological safety, the condition, the atmosphere, the climate, is a result of the way we are going to interact. So the working definition of culture that I use, Claire, is the way we interact. 4 words. Now,
Yeah.
so this is another thing that's become even clearer with additional research. Now, people might say, well, hang on, Tim, wait a second. There's so much more to culture. Culture is attitudes and values and traditions and mores and customs. It's language, it's artifacts, it's structure. It goes on and on. And I would say yes. And please understand that all of those things find expression at the human interface. So it all comes together when we interact. So if we have our eye on the way we interact, I think we get to the essence of culture.
I love that because, again, that's an action and not a state.
Right.
Uh, uh, and one of the things that I notice in coaching is that people say, I create a safe space for the people I work with.
Uh-huh.
And I go, well, how do you know that?
Yeah.
Because safety isn't what you think.
No,
Safety
it's
is
not.
what you both is what you both think, experience, and agree,
Mm-hmm.
which is different, isn't it?
Well, let me issue a caveat on that, Claire, because there's a prevailing idea, and it comes out of some researchers in this area. They say that psychological safety is the shared belief that it's safe for us, right, to personally interact. I reject that completely. It is
Yeah.
not shared. It is not shared. And the reason that we know this is because in our 4 stages team survey that we use all around the world for thousands of teams, it's very clear that it's not shared. So you can have a team of, say, 10 people, and each person takes the survey, which is a 12-item psychometric scale, and they are having very different experiences one from another.
Mm.
And so it is not a shared understanding or belief or perception. It's very much individual.
Mm.
And then further to your point, Claire, based on what you just said, often a leader, say a leader of a team, the leader thinks, oh, my team is very safe, psychologically safe. And the leader is projecting their experience onto the team, but it's not true at all, because when we gather the empirical data, it shows that that is anything but the case.
Mm.
And this happens again and again. So the experience that I'm having as a leader is one thing, but the experience that you're having as a member of the team is something quite different.
Yeah. So it's all experience, real, mine.
Yep, it's yours.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was doing a group supervision this morning and we were talking about safety. And it was becoming really clear in the way that they were discussing with each other. This is a group that's been together for a year. And they were talking about their coaching relationships and how safe they feel or don't feel. And it's very different. For one person, it was this. For someone else, it was that.
Yeah.
Yes, so it's not like a certificate, is it?
No.
This
No.
space is certifiably safe.
Yeah, there's no such thing.
Yeah.
And remember how fluid and dynamic a team is, any social collective for that matter.
Yeah.
Very fluid, very dynamic. Things are changing, conditions change. And so one of the, I guess, the premise that I like to begin with, Claire, is that the leader, whatever the organizational unit may be, the leader is the chief cultural architect. And that's part of your responsibility. It's embedded in your role. And you actually cannot delegate or even abdicate that role if you wanted to. You can't, because by virtue of your position, you will exert the greatest influence on the prevailing norms of that team. Now, everyone else will contribute too, but if you're the leader, you have you have a more potent, scalable impact by virtue of your position. You can't separate yourself from that, right? You can't come to work tomorrow and say, I don't want to be the cultural architect of this team. I'm going to take some time off and then I'll resume that responsibility. That's not how it works. It's embedded in what you do in your role.
The way we interact.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. What's your hope for the impact of the work that you're doing?
What an insightful question. My hope is that that leaders and everyone in an organization, individual contributors, that they will understand the profound impact of culture, and that psychological safety is the foundation of healthy, productive human interaction, and that there is no alternative to that. There's no replacement for that, right? There's no shortcut for that. There's no workaround for that. There's no backdoor for that. Basically, the central mechanism of culture formation is to model and then reward vulnerability. We all have that responsibility to do that. If we're part of a team, if we're part of an organization, we all carry that responsibility. Can I tell you a little story?
Please.
Okay. So if you go back to the first industrial revolution, we go back to 1788 and we go to London, or say we go to Birmingham or we go to Manchester, we go to one of the industrial centers of the first industrial revolution, and we get in our time machine, we go back. If we walk outside, what's the quality of the air? It's really bad.
It is.
Smoky, it's sooty, it's black, and chimneys dot the skyline. It is a coal-fired economy. Mechanization, mass production have come into the world. Back in 1788, in some cases, the chimney sweepers throughout the city, in some cases, they were conscripting boys as young as 4 years old to work with them for long hours and under very dangerous conditions. And finally, British Parliament called time out, and they said, hang on, this is not right. And so they passed what is known as the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788. And it's fascinating. You can find the full text of the law online today. It's quite fascinating. Out of that law came a concept that is called the duty of care.
Yeah.
And the duty of care means that we have a responsibility to look after each other in the workplace. We have a stewardship to keep each other safe. Now, of course, back in 1788 and for many years subsequent to that time, it was all about physical safety. That was the entire paradigm. The entire lens was physical safety. So let's go find hazards and dangers and threats and risks, and let's remove them. What's changed is that that safety, we finally, after more than 2 centuries, we finally have a complete, holistic, integrated conception of safety, because we finally put in the centerpiece, which is psychological safety. Sometimes we say psychosocial, but those words are pretty much interchangeable. So my point is that concept of the duty of care applies to the psychological and the emotional and the social realms as well. And we have a duty of care to each other. That's what I believe. And I think that we're coming to that. I think there's a great awakening. There's a realization that the duty of care extends to those domains. And I'm very grateful for that, because it will make a massive difference in the lives of many people if we take that seriously, and if we are very careful, respectful. So as I say in the conceptual framework, psychological safety is a function of respect and permission, right? It lives at the intersection of those two things. So my point is, if we interact that way and we're guided with that sense that we have a duty of care, I think many things get better.
The massive difference. What's your hope for the massive difference? Because we can see the massive difference that 1788 duty of care has had slowly over time.
Yeah.
What's your hope for the massive difference that this wider definition of duty of care might look like?
I think it feeds back into the outcomes that we talked about earlier, Claire. the outcomes related to employee health and wellness, building deeply inclusive environments, accelerating learning agility in organizations. And then, of course, the some of those important outcomes like productivity and like innovation, which can increase the overall standard of living for many, many people. So I see it as both economic and non-economic in terms of the outcomes that we aspire to. And we understand this more than ever in the history of the world, because now we have the empirical research to back it up. We see the cause and effect relationships. It's so exciting to see where what is now possible.
Mm.
But it puts a I don't know if burden is the word, but it's the stewardship that leaders now have. I don't think they fully understood it in years past, but now they can. That a leader is responsible for conditions.
Mm.
The leader is responsible for the physical conditions, the psychological conditions. And so you have to take ownership for that. So as leaders do that, I think many things will improve.
And that's a courageous journey.
Oh, it is. Well, that's interesting that you use that word, Claire, because I think what it requires of leaders is that they have to overcome the imperial model of leadership, right? They have to create, they have to bring humility. They have to let go of their ego defense mechanisms and their pride of authorship. And they have to be able to work together with their direct reports, with their colleagues, really with that humility and that sense that, I'm a fellow traveler with you. I have a job, you have a job. We're collaborating in a rich and productive way. And yes, we may have hierarchy structurally, but culturally, we are flat. There's a big difference.
Mm.
Right? So we have structural hierarchy, but we have cultural flatness. And so we become much more agnostic to title and position and authority. We neutralize those liabilities of hierarchy. That makes a massive difference. So I think that we have the opportunity now to move more in that direction, Claire. So how could you not be excited about that?
Well, yeah, I'm very excited by that. But I'm also aware you talked about ego and status.
Yes.
We published a book last year called The Human Behind the Coach about being human as a coach. And when we started writing it 3 years ago, I don't know whether I didn't notice there was a lot written about humanity. And I only started noticing when the book, as in the writing of the book, or whether actually I think it is more a part of the conversation now. But being able to demonstrate that level of humanity at work is a big shift, isn't it, for many leaders?
It is. It is. Ironically, we have entered the age of AI, but my thesis is that the future is human.
I agree completely.
More than ever.
Yeah.
We have to humanize organizations that to one degree or another, could be a little, could be a lot, in the past have become dehumanized. And that's not only the opportunity, but I think it's the moral imperative that we all have.
Mm.
So I look at the future and say, fantastic, we'll be AI enabled in much of what we do. That's fine. But the future is human.
What a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think so.
So, can we talk about leaders, and can we also talk about people in one-to-one relationships like coaches?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I notice is that in Simplifying Coaching, that came out 3 years ago, I think, one of the things I said is that coaching isn't someone who's sorted working with someone who's not sorted. It's one human facilitating the thinking of another human.
Yeah.
And you said right at the beginning of this conversation that psychological safety is a culture that rewards vulnerability. And I'm just wondering in your thoughts about how does the leader become appropriately vulnerable? What does that look like in
Mm-hmm.
service of that journey? How does the coach become appropriately vulnerable without
Mm-hmm.
leaking?
Okay. Well, if you go back to what I said, the mechanism is two parts. So there's modeling vulnerability and there's rewarding vulnerability.
Mm.
In a relationship with the coach and the coachee, I think the coach has a first mover obligation. The coach is responsible for those conditions. The coach is responsible for that container. The coach is responsible to create the environment to draw out the coachee. I think that's the nature of the relationship. So there's a first mover obligation to model the vulnerability and then reward because what's going to happen is the person being coached comes into the relationship and has to do what all humans do and engage in threat detection,
Yeah.
even in a coaching relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It's one-on-one, or it could be group coaching, but nevertheless, they have to do the threat detection. So that means they are looking for evidence that their vulnerability, will be rewarded. That's what they're looking for. So they're stacking evidence. If it's one-on-one, then for example, if you and I, Claire, are engaged in a coaching relationship and you're coaching me, the only thing I can look to as I do threat detection is you. And more specifically, I'm going to look for evidence that you are modeling vulnerability, which gives me the invitation to do the same. And then, so that's part one, is that I'm looking for you to model the vulnerability. Part two is when you model the vulnerability, that is a tacit invitation for me to do the same. If I respond and I do the same and I engage in an act of vulnerability, then part two is I am going to wait for the response to see if I'm rewarded. And if I am, then I have two pieces of data. Number one, you've modeled vulnerability yourself. Number two, you have rewarded my vulnerability. On that basis, and on that basis alone, I will likely go forward and demonstrate vulnerability in the relationship. What's interesting is that both reward and risk originate from the same thing, and
Oh,
that's vulnerability.
yeah.
We will not have any kind of a productive relationship. We will not make progress without the enabling condition of vulnerability. But I know intuitively the reward comes from there, but the risks come from there as well.
Mm.
And so it's delicate. But going back to your original question, I believe that the coach has the first mover obligation.
That is such a beautiful phrase. The first mover obligation. Because that's not about choice, is it? It's actually about, as you say, responsibility.
I think so. Yeah. I don't, it's more than an opportunity. It's a
Mm.
responsibility. If you're the coach, right? If you presume to be a coach, then you are responsible to shape the terms of engagement, right? It goes back to, so this is where Carl Rogers helped us by saying we need conditions of unconditional positive regard, but he didn't articulate the specific mechanism. And I think the specific mechanism is going back to modeling and then rewarding the vulnerability. Those are two sides to the same coin. It comes back to that mechanism.
Mm. Mm. And what a challenge that is for listeners.
Yeah, it's not easy.
No, and the coaching profession is kind of professionalized, and that kind of brings us into the space where there might be an assumption that you need to look professional in order to be able to engage professionally.
Yeah.
But that doesn't feel safe.
No. Well, you have to be careful there. Two comments there, Claire. One is, let's go back to, so let's invoke the work of Arlie Hochschild. She was a sociologist at UC Berkeley, and she pioneered, I love her work. She's now retired, but she pioneered the concept of emotional labor.
Ah.
And in any job, you think of any job, whatever the job may be, there's an emotional labor component that is required for the job. For example, let's say that you are a doctor, a physician, and you treat patients. Well, you have your technical expertise in your area, but it's also very important that you're interacting with the patient. And so there's an emotional labor requirement. And this is true of every job. Some jobs have more of an emotional labor requirement than others, perhaps. Okay, now think about the coach. Think about the massive requirement for emotional labor as a coach. Now, then she makes a finer distinction between surface acting and deep acting. Surface acting, as she says, is when you're trying to generate the emotions that are required based on the emotional labor requirement of your job, but you're not able to produce them. You can't quite produce them. Right? So it's a synthetic experience because the coaching relationship requires genuine emotional labor delivered in good faith. You can't fake that. You can try, right? And you might get away with it for a while. What I'm saying is the surface acting is not going to work. You need what she calls deep acting, where we are now delivering the actual emotional labor that is required, the actual emotions. They are real, they are genuine, there's nothing counterfeit about it. That's required as a coach. So if you come in and you don't produce that, you may be highly intelligent, you may have charisma, there may be a certain dash, charm, style, magnetism about your personality. Doesn't matter. Does not matter if you cannot produce the emotional labor that's required in that relationship. And much of that has to do with the genuine concern for the other person. So if you're preoccupied with yourself, you're losing from the beginning. You're not going to get there.
Yeah.
Right. This is what's required.
Absolutely. And I you've just defined beautifully the difference between the AI version of coaching that will come,
That's
which
right.
is which is the surface acting,
That's the
versus
synthetic experience.
yeah,
Yeah.
versus the human deep acting.
Yeah. It's very true. Very, very true.
And what a great message that we need to work on ourselves.
We do. Yeah. Yeah. We have to do that first. There's a requirement for that. Yeah. The other, I'll just add a corollary principle, Claire, that's very important. I think it goes hand in hand with what we've talked about, and that is that the operating assumption for most coaching is that the solution resides within the person that is being coached.
Except when
And
it
so,
doesn't.
and so if that's true, which I believe it is most of the time, then what we're really doing as we coach is we are engaging in facilitated self-discovery. We're trying to help that person create the capacity to self-diagnose and self-correct. That's what we're trying to do.
Mm.
We're trying to help them do that for themselves. The last thing we want is to create dependency and learned helplessness. We don't want a paternalistic relationship. We're just feeding our ego if we're doing that.
Yeah.
And it's mind-boggling to me that in both a therapeutic setting and in a professional setting, I see so many instances where coaches, therapists, and others create these long-term dependent relationships. Something is fundamentally wrong. We're not getting anywhere. That is not the goal. Right? So the alarm should be going off and people should be saying, hang on a second, this is self-serving. We're perpetuating a dysfunctional relationship. We're not building capability and self-reliance in the individual. That's not what this is about.
I can hear our listeners cheering.
What's the alternative? I mean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And interestingly, there was a thing on Twitter I was saying to you before we started recording this morning about somebody who's done some research into psychologists and psychiatrists
Mm-hmm.
who and how much people do or don't enjoy power.
Sure.
And how that shows up in relationships. But I
Yeah.
absolutely agree. You you've said so many things that I've written. It's beautiful to talk to somebody where there's an agreement about this partnership, and I loved what you said about this is about facilitated self-discovery to enable people to self-correct.
Yeah. I think I'll add one more concept. I'll layer on one more concept. Well, this is actually really fundamental, Claire. Here's I'll share with you the working definition of leadership that I use. Now, I spend most of my time is training executive teams. That's what I do. That's what I spend most of my time doing. And so we use a working definition. First of all, we use a framework that says there are 3 domains of leadership: lead self, leads the team, leads the business.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of those as concentric circles. And there's a linear progression. There's a threshold requirement to lead yourself, and then lead a team, and then lead a larger part of an organization, or perhaps the entire organization. So with that framework in mind, here's the working definition of leadership that I use. Leadership is taking action and accountability to create positive results. Now, that definition has to sink in. Action and accountability, that's a package deal. When you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other. So the action comes with the accountability, meaning if I make a choice, there are consequences. I have to own those consequences. And I should never try to separate or divorce the action from the accountability. That's leadership, to create then positive results. So if I get unintended consequences, I own that. As long as you keep the action and accountability together, we make progress. But in this little world of ours, so often we go into patterns of deflection. We want to separate the action from the accountability. That's when we get into trouble. Because ultimately, when it comes to improvement, this in a coaching relationship, we get to a point, we get to a crossroads, we get to a critical juncture where we need to improve, we need to change, we need to do something. There are only two options. We can change or we can self-medicate. That's all there is. We can change or we can change our belief about needing to change. That's all we have. I mean, if we go back to the theory of cognitive dissonance, right? Leon Festinger, he said, when humans get into a state of cognitive dissonance, meaning my actions are inconsistent with my beliefs and my values, it creates a state of disharmony within me, dissonance. Humans don't like that. And so we will immediately take steps to reduce the dissonance, to get rid of that painful condition. Well, how do you remove the dissonance? There's only two things you can do. You can change so that to restore the harmony, now there's consistency between what you do and what you believe and value. Or you can simply change your belief and say, I don't need to change. So I can justify, I can rationalize, I can deflect by going into denial, blame, or excuse. So those are always options, and we've all done that. We've all done that many times. Progress comes when we start to do that less, just a little bit less, and a little bit less, and a little bit less. So so that means you have to take the harder road, which is to change rather than to self-medicate. And I mean that in the non-pharmaceutical sense of the word. But that's really what it comes down to. Coaching, the coach will never change the person being coached. It's a completely false concept.
Absolutely.
The therapist will never change the patient. So we need to repudiate that completely. Just clear the decks. We're going to help the person try to figure out what they need to do, and then they need to go do it. And that is the only way that we make progress. So that I'll add that on. That's why leadership to me is taking action and accountability together, never to be separated, to create positive results.
Thank you. And a little bit creates movement. I love your use of the word a little bit, phrase, a little bit.
A little bit.
Well, Timothy, I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much for coming to the Coaching Inn. Timothy's book is The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, and he has lots of great stuff on the internet. If people want to continue a conversation with you, is there a way they can do that?
Sure. Reach out on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
That's a great place to go. And as you said, Claire, the website is filled with all kinds of free resources that might be helpful as well.
Brilliant. So, Timothy Clarke, thank you so much for coming. And thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching In, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.